Hello everybody, welcome to this lecture, which is North American Forest Cover Types. So we're going to kind of try and tie it back in to our previous lectures. So in the previous lecture, or in one of the previous lectures, we talked about the idea of biomes. And the idea with biomes is that they're separated by the amount of precipitation that they get and by their temperature, and it's a larger classification for all the different areas within the world. So now when we start talking about forests, we're going into a lower level of classification because we're only talking about part of the world. And so now we're going to kind of break it up into a few more categories. So in terms of the forests that we're going to talk about today, we're going to focus on North American forests. So within that, we're going to talk about the Canadian forests. And so that's going to be boreal forest or taiga. It's going to fall into that biome for the most of it. Some of the Canadian forest falls into temperate coniferous forest, but what we'll kind of focus on is the boreal forests. And then for our U.S. forests, our eastern forests, that's going to fall into the temperate forest category, as well as our southern forests and our western forests also fall into the temperate forest category. You're going to see much more broadleaf trees in the east, conifer trees in the south, and conifer trees in the west. There's other biomes mixed in there, but those are the ones that we're focusing on for our lecture. So the way that we're going to break it down into different forests, and those forests are going to be separated by cover type. And so when we're talking about cover type, we're talking about a category of forest being defined by its vegetation and locality, so the composition of the trees. And so specifically, how are we going to define cover type? Now we're going to use the Society of American Foresters criteria for cover type. So that means that the dominant species must be 25% of the area. So as we go through each of these forests, I'm going to talk about the different species and the different dominant cover types. And that means, so if I mention a dominant cover type, that means that in that area there's at least a quarter of it. Now it doesn't, the second part of this, it has to occupy a fairly large area in the aggregate. So it doesn't have to be continuous. You don't have to look at it and say, okay, well there is 1/4 of continuous trees of that species. It can be little bits here and little bits there and little bits there, but as long as it makes up within that forest about 1/4 of the forest, then it's a dominant species. And then the third part is we're going to base it entirely on biological considerations. We're really just looking at the biology of the tree and of the forest. And so here's kind of our breakdown on the left of the different forests that we're going to look at. So let's start off with the east. The east, you could break it up into smaller regions. I'm going to kind of keep it the way that it is in your book. That way it's much easier for you guys to understand. But if we were going by the Society of American Foresters cover types, they would break it down into 5 regions within the eastern forest. We are going to focus on the northern forest, the central forest, the southern forest, and then we're also within the southern forest, we're going to have the bottomland forest. So that's what we're going to focus on in terms of the eastern forest. So when we're talking about the eastern forest, these are the areas that we're going to be focusing on. So the northern forest, we're focused on the New England area, New York, upper parts of the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, so the Great Lakes areas, also parts of Pennsylvania and the Appalachian Mountains. Our major cover types, so remember these are the ones that are covering about 1/4 of the area. So we've got spruce, fir, pine, and hemlock, and northern hardwoods. Now, if you're saying to yourself, I don't know what any of those are, I understand, and it's definitely something that I'm not going to quiz you on, but I do want to kind of paint this picture of what do the different trees in the different areas of the United States look like. And so if you ended up there, you kind of have at least an idea of what might be there. So 5 species of trees that are dominant in this area: balsam fir, northern white cedar, eastern pine, eastern white pine, eastern hemlock, and yellow birch. So let's take a look at some of that. So this is the area that we're focusing on. I didn't really get Minnesota in there, but this is the general area that we're going to be looking at. So on the left here, this is red spruce, and on the right here, this is balsam fir. So you can see those are 2 coniferous or cone-bearing trees. And so when we say spruce fir, these are the trees that we're saying are dominant when we say spruce fir. And when you look out in the background of these pictures, you can kind of see why. This is eastern white pine. So it's also a conifer, but has a slightly different look to it. It has these whorled branches that makes it stick out. And then we have some northern hardwoods, which we said was another dominant cover type. So we have sugar maple, which is known for maple syrup. That's the tree that you take the sap from to make maple syrup. We have American beech, very similar tree with beech nuts as its fruit. And then we have yellow birch, which is really distinct with its white bark. So 3 different hardwood or broadleaf trees that kind of make up northern hardwoods. There's many more, just kind of giving you 3 broad examples. What a lot of people, what tends to stick out for a lot of people about the northern forest is how amazing and colorful it is when you get to the deciduous, the part of fall right before the leaves come off. So a lot of people will actually travel to the Northeast to go and just see the trees change color and see all the different beautiful colors that the trees will become. And you can see just through this graphic the idea of the regular colors, and then all of a sudden we get this bright change with right before the leaves die off in fall. So it's something that actually draws people to the northern forest. So in terms of the northern forest, these areas have stayed forest for a long time because they've been poor farming soils. This is where we first had the establishment of kind of the forest industry in this country. We talked about the first sawmill in 1623, I think it was in York, Maine. So really this area has been forestry for a long time. This area has seen a lot of consumption of its forest because of all the settling during the colonial period, where eastern white pine was a major species during that time. And during the mid-1800s, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maine all led the nation in timber production. Nowadays, you'll see hardwoods in this area being used for handles, flooring, for furniture, and a lot of recreation being done in these forests. In terms of the central forest, the major cover type is upland oaks. So a lot of different species of oak trees. In fact, in this area, it's a really diverse area in terms of there's more than 20 genera. So in our classification system, we talk about species. The next classification up is genus. And so we're saying there's more than 20 different genuses in this area. And when it comes to species, there's over 75 different tree species being represented in this central forest. It's got a great diversity of climate and soils. And so there's a large number of broadleaf species or hardwood species in this area. White oak is the region's most important and widely distributed tree. And a reason for that is white oak is super popular in terms of barrel making. So anybody who's into whiskey production or wine production, white oak is the preferred species for making barrels. A slight interesting bit of information, at least for me, is that barrel making is the term for barrel making is called cooperage. I thought it's just in thinking about barrel making, I thought that term would be different, but cooperage is barrel making. So when we're talking about the Central Forest, we're talking about this area here. What's interesting to note is that when you look at that, you see a large portion of that area without forest, and that's because it's been converted to agriculture. And the reason for that, I'll go back. The reason for that is that these areas have really deep and really rich soils. So it's great farming land. So one of the first things we said about the northern forest was that it was poor farming soils. So that's why the northern forest has kind of stayed the northern forest. Whereas this area, you've got really good soils for farming. So a lot of this has been converted, deforested and converted to agriculture. So this is your typical hardwood forest. You can see that when you look at this photo, you can see, well, some of these trees are the same, but some of them look different, and that's kind of your typical mixture of a hardwood forest. Here's a couple of examples of hardwood trees. On the left here is white oak. It's a really big white oak, and I put this picture right here where you can see the white colored bark that goes along with white oak, and that's why it's called white oak. And then over here is northern red oak, and these are some red oak leaves down here at the bottom. Both two different species of oak trees. So, like I mentioned before, with the central region, it's deep, rich soil, so a lot of the area has been replaced or converted to agriculture. You get a large assortment of forest products because hardwoods, because of all the different types of hardwoods, you can get lots of different uses out of the different trees. So railroad ties. If you don't know what a railroad tie is, that's the piece of wood that goes in the ground, and then they take the tracks and they spike the tracks into the piece of wood to start forming the tracks. So that's a railroad tie. Cooperage, we explained earlier, that's the idea of barrel making, where white oak is very popular in that process. Flooring, furniture, cabinets, back in the day, shipbuilding, and still people for recreation like to make ships out of hardwoods. Also in this area, you get a species called eastern red cedar, which if you've ever seen somebody talk about like a cedar chest or a cedar closet, that's usually eastern red cedar, and the cedar specifically has these moth repellent properties, so people like to make closets or chests out of them to keep insects away from their clothing. And then because these are angiosperms, broadleaf trees, they're fruit-bearing trees, so you get a lot of fruit for wildlife. So acorns, walnuts, beech nuts, all those different fruits available for wildlife. So hunting is popular in this area. Next, in our eastern forest, we got the southern forest. Now, the southern forest, the way that it's described is, some people say that it goes all the way from southern New Jersey all the way down to Florida and then all the way west to Texas. Your major cover types for the southern forest: southern yellow pine, oak and pine, and then bottomland hardwoods. And so with that, what's interesting about the southern yellow pine is that it does naturally grow in this area, but it's been changed to really more of a focus of plantation pine forestry. And so that's where it's active management and where you're not really letting nature take its course. When you're doing plantation pine forestry, you're making sure that you're actively managing. So a lot of silviculture, a lot of intense forest management where you are the one planting the trees and you're planting them in rows and you're trying to get every tree to grow the same because you're really interested in production of wood. And so that's what characterizes this area and makes it the wood basket of the United States. Now there's other parts that go to it that really help make it the wood basket, but one of the big ideas is that there's a focus on production. And the reason that there's a focus on production with this area as opposed to the western United States is the eastern United States, especially the southern forest. That's where we get a lot of that private forest ownership that we talked about in the first lecture. And so a lot of the landowners here are trying to make money. They're this might be trying to put their kid through college, or this is their supplemental income, or this is how this is the family business being passed on from generation to generation. But this is where we get a lot of those non-industrial private forest landowners living in this area, and they're interested in producing wood, and so therefore this is where we get the majority of our timber from in the United States, is from the southern forest. And so it's the wood basket of the United States. What also helps is you have close to a year-round growing season, and you don't have to deal with topography. It's a flat area, so that also really helps in trying to make it the wood basket. But then if you throw all that together, so private ownership instead of federal management, heavily focused on plantation pine forestry, and an area that grows pine trees really well, which pine trees are pretty easy to grow in terms of intensive management. Then a year-long growing season, lots of ways to get to the trees, lack of topography, all that works out really well in terms of making this the wood basket of the United States. There are 4 southern pines that are important: the longleaf pine, loblolly pine, slash pine, and shortleaf pine. Now, all 4 of these their biggest purpose is dimensional lumber. So when we say dimensional lumber, what you see at Lowe's and Home Depot, 2x4s, 4x4s, 4x6s, 4x8s, all that dimensional lumber that then becomes the wood used in houses or tables or whatever purpose that might be. Sometimes kind of think of it as the hidden wood. Hardwoods have a much nicer look to them, so that's kind of outside wood, whereas pine wood is much more of inside wood, where it's all hidden behind walls and hidden inside of sofas and furnitures and things like that. It's great wood. It's very useful. It just isn't as pretty as some of the hardwoods. Here's just kind of putting it, giving you kind of a picture to that southern forest and some of the major forest types, according to at least this infographic. This one only shows it going up to Virginia, but like we said before, some people consider it all the way up to southern New Jersey as part of that same southern forest. But what I want to point out is the pine part of this area, because the pine trees are really important, being the coniferous species that dominates this area. And you can see, so when we talk about longleaf and loblolly and slash pine and shortleaf, those are those pines. And look, that is this whole southeastern corner, except for this area right here in brown, this oak gum cypress. And that's going to be our bottomland forest, which is what we'll talk about next, and how that kind of, it's its own little forest within this southern forest. But you can see this huge area here of pine trees that just goes throughout the southeastern United States, and it's a huge industry down there. I mean, if you look at some of these states, you look at Alabama, you look at Georgia, you look at South Carolina, the whole state practically is covered in forest, which makes it a really big industry for a lot of people. Looking at our map, like we had before, there's the area that we're focusing on. You can see I tried to get southern New Jersey in there, the way that it's described, and so, but you can kind of see on this map we're talking about this forest right here, and whether you say it ends right here or whether you say it kind of continues up there, that's the area that we're focused on. And so this is Plantation Forestry. This is our cover type of southern yellow pine. Some of these trees, in terms of longleaf, loblolly, slash pine, they're really hard to distinguish from each other when they get mature. When they're younger, they're a little more obvious. When they get this big, they're hard to tell apart. Short leaf's a little bit easier because the pine needles are very short and the cones are very small, so it's much easier to tell short leaf from the other three. But this type of forestry, it's not really what we see here in California, but it's something I've spent the last decade basically working in, and just these pines and lines. Almost, you're really taking kind of a similar approach that you do to agriculture to your trees. It's really just, it becomes a perennial crop instead of a annual crop. So this area, in terms of its history, it's got a lot of sandy soils. So sandy soils don't really work for agriculture because they have a hard time holding water. And so that's why this area has ended up kind of staying in timber production as opposed to converting to ag the way that the Central Forest did. In terms of agriculture, though, they did have a lot of cotton production, tobacco production back in the day. Some of that still exists, but the majority of that went westward to places like Texas, Arkansas. But going back to this idea of it being the wood basket, you've got a kind of a very mild climate. You got abundant rainfall, so you get a very long growing season, which makes it really easy for you to grow trees. It's a large land area. You get rapid tree growth because you got good soils for growing trees and almost year-round growing season. So we get more pulpwood production. That's the idea of taking smaller trees and converting them into pulp, and then that pulp can get turned into all sorts of different things. Paper comes from pulp, so toilet paper, cardboard, everything from the thing that holds your 12-pack of Coca-Cola to the toilet paper you use for your butt to the piece of paper you're hopefully writing down notes on from this lecture. All of that comes from pulpwood. That industry moved down from the northern forests when they realized that they could be quite successful in the south because of the longer growing season. And then it used to also produce about 60% of the world's turpentine and rosins. So that's those are chemicals used in paints and varnishes and then all sorts of other chemicals. But a big product that comes from this area, because you can get nice, straight, beautiful trees that grow pretty quick, are poles. So like telephone poles and pilings for piers and docks, things like that. Things where you need a big, long, straight tree, basically. And so those are actually the most expensive product that you can get off of at least off of pine timber. So this area is, even the little trees are getting used in pulpwood, and the big trees are getting used for poles and for dimensional lumber. So it's quite an industry in terms of timber production down in the southeast, in the southern forest. So the bottomland forest within the southern forest. So really this area is the Mississippi River floodplain, but what has now become the brown loam bluffs of the Mississippi River because of all of the sediment that is kind of piled up along the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, where basically the Mississippi River starts off in Minnesota and has this huge watershed, over 1 million acre watershed. And then that all eventually works its way down and flows out into the Gulf of Mexico through New Orleans. And so what has happened is the lower part of the Mississippi River has gotten all of this sediment and all of this good soil that is washed down in it. So this area now has changed. It's not really the same as the rest of the southern forest. This area has a lot of swampy areas, has a lot of areas within floodplains. So some areas stay wet all the time, some don't. The ones that don't have usually been converted over to some sort of agriculture. Our principal species that we see in these areas: bald cypress, which is a conifer tree; water tupelo, another name for water tupelo is swamp black gum, which is a hardwood tree; cottonwood trees, and then a lot of different species of bottomland hardwoods, but the ones we'll kind of focus on are cherry bark oak and live oak. And so when we're talking about the bottomland hardwood forest, we're really talking about this area. You can't really see it well on this map, but it's the idea that right here the Mississippi River is flowing right down here, and so it's really this area right along the border between Mississippi and Arkansas, and Mississippi and Louisiana. So this right here is bald cypress. It's usually extremely noticeable in terms of, because it stays in the water usually all year, it's got this what we call buttressing, or it widens out at the base. Something that you might also see with bald cypress is that because it's underwater a lot, bald cypress has what they call knees, which you can kind of see on this tree right here. But it's basically the roots are trying to come up and be up out of the water. And so you'll get kind of aerial roots, or what they call bald cypress knees. Right here is swamp black gum, which you can see is a very similar looking tree because it grows in a very similar area. It's got the same buttressing, but it's a broadleaf tree, whereas looking over here, this is going to be a conifer tree. Some of our hardwood species, so we talked about cottonwoods. Cottonwood is a pioneer species, grows real quick, grows right usually along the banks of a river or right in a floodplain. And then also cherry bark oak, which can be a really valuable species if you get nice, beautiful, straight, tall ones like this. And then live oak, which was really important back in the early 1700s for shipbuilding. The U.S. Navy was basically built out of live oak, but this is kind of what people recognize live oak for nowadays, having these big, huge limbs and having the Spanish moss or old man's beard hanging off of it. So it's usually picturesque, and you see it in a lot of movies when they talk about the South. So in this area, you do get some areas lost to farming. Definitely a lot of swampy areas, a lot of wet areas, because the whole area is basically the Mississippi River floodplain. So some areas have been logged, some haven't, because they're just inaccessible and there's no way to get to them. Some of these areas have stayed wilderness and not really even been mapped out or surveyed, and you get a lot of hunting in these areas. Your major wood uses, you do get dimensional lumber out of some of these species, but really you get more of your hardwood uses. So caskets, boxes, cooperage, which is barrel making, railroad ties, and ships. And that takes us to our western forest cover types. So according to SAF, we'd have 6 regions. We have northern interior, high elevations, mid elevations, and low elevations, which are all in the interior. And then we have the North Pacific and South Pacific. That's within our West Coast forest. But we're going to talk about the western interior forest, and we're going to talk about the West Coast forest. And so here is our map. And so this, when we're talking about the western forest, this is the part that we're talking about. Basically, we got our eastern forest over here, we got our Great Plains in the middle of the country, and then everything that's west, we got the Rocky Mountains, we got the Sierra Nevada Mountains, and we got the Coast Range Mountains, and then the Transverse Mountains down here. And that's where we see basically almost all of our trees, because we have the Great Basin, Mojave Desert, Sonoran Desert in between those areas. So let's start off with the Western Interior Forest. So the Western Interior Forest is basically all along the Rocky Mountains area from Canada to Mexico. What really makes a difference, because this is a huge area, this is hundreds of millions of acres of trees, but it produces something like only 6% of the wood that we use in this country, because 75% of this region is managed by federal agencies, and of that, 3/4 of this forest that's being managed by federal agencies, 60% of it's national forest. So that means that there's supposed to be these areas where we can get timber off of them, because these are those timber reserves that were set up in the past. However, because of things like the National Environmental Protection Act, which I think is a good thing, but maybe just needs to be adjusted, which I know the Trump administration was working on, and also the idea of some environmentalists thinking that these areas need to be more protected than they are, and not really understanding the idea that these areas are to be used. National parks, wilderness areas, those things, national wildlife refuges, those were set aside to be more preservation type areas, but the national forests were set up as conservation working areas. But so there's still a lot of legal battles with trying to get these areas logged. But then what's become also problematic is without logging these areas, without letting fires burn in these areas, we've now got huge insect problems where millions and millions of acres of trees are dead and dying because of mountain pine beetle problems. So at your I've listed some principal species here, but it's really going to depend on your elevations. And so as we read these, we're going to go up in elevation. So our lower elevations, pinyon juniper is what we're going to see. Ponderosa pine at our middle elevations, at our high elevations, lodgepole pine, and then at our basically our really high elevations, Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. And then up above that, you get to tree line where trees can't that it's too much physiological stress on them, so they don't grow above that. So here's our western interior area stretching all the way from Canada down to Mexico, and this actually continues, and we'll show that when we go and look at the Canadian and Mexican forests. So looking at those different regions, so when we talk about the northern or the very high elevation within the western interior, that's very similar to the boreal forest and has a lot of similar traits to the boreal forest biome. Then we talked about high elevations, so Engelmann spruce, Briscoe pine. Middle elevations, Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, quaking aspen, grand fir. Low elevations, cottonwood willow, ponderosa pine, pinyon juniper. So actually, I think on the previous slide, I kind of bumped some of those up. Ponderosa pine is a low elevation, lodgepole pine's a middle elevation, and then our spruce was at high elevations. And then we have even the boreal with some other different spruce and paper birch above that. Sorry about that. So looking at the northern, so very highest up above this, we'd be hitting tree line. We've got white spruce, which is a conifer species, and we got paper birch, which is this tree, that distinct white bark that we've seen before. At our high elevations, we get bristlecone pine and we get Engelmann spruce, and notice you can kind of see just how high up we mean, because you can see that we're hitting tree line up above some of these species. So, this is it. Anything that goes up higher and the trees can't actually handle it. The middle elevations look a lot different. We get these big coniferous forests. So we get quaking aspen, which is in the same family as cottonwood trees. Douglas fir, which we'll also see on the West Coast forest. Grand fir, which we'll see in the West Coast forest as well. It's in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then lodgepole pine. And this picture, I mentioned earlier the idea of lacking disturbance in this area. And you can see how many dead conifer trees there are. Because if you're sitting there going, well, but those trees have some color, right? And so that can be deciduous. But look at the trees. Look at the shape of them. They're all conifer trees. And conifer trees don't, for the most part, and especially not lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine's an evergreen tree, so it doesn't change color. So those are all dead trees from mountain pine beetle. Here's another look at quaking aspen. I just thought this kind of really painted the picture of the western interior forest. So, we've got our quaking aspen over here, but you can see all of our lodgepole or ponderosa pine, more than likely lodgepole. And then you can see the mixture of quaking aspen and probably some other hardwoods mixed in there with the conifer trees. And eventually we'll go high enough up to where we don't get any trees because we're too high up above it to where it's too much stress on them. So our lower elevations, we'll see cottonwood or willow, usually along streams and rivers. So you can see down here, same thing. This right here, this is something typical you'll see in the West. And when you see something like that, you can pretty much guarantee yourself there's some sort of water, some sort of stream, river, lake, something there that makes it, because when we see trees, we know we have water. And especially when we see shrubs and grass, and then all of a sudden we see trees, we know one of the things that's going to drive that is a consistent source of water. Ponderosa pine, very large conifer species, really distinctive bark pattern on ponderosa pine. And then pinyon juniper, a small, two different small conifers. Pinyons, you can get pine nuts from them. There's Italian stone pines are really where you get like the majority of your pine nuts, but you can get pine nuts off of pinyon trees as well. Sometimes you'll see them called pinyons, and that's off of the pinyon pines. But you can see kind of the lower elevations kind of scattered, almost a woodland type coverage, but enough that we still think of it as a forest cover type. So with this area, you got a lot of what could be commercial species. Ponderosa pine, western white pine, Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and Engelmann spruce are all good commercial species. But really, they're only serving smaller forest industries because of the federal management. A lot of local use. Also really limited by topography and by access to these areas, because you got a lot of topography that you have to deal with, which makes transportation issues and moving equipment and trying to get equipment into areas pretty difficult. But it's a huge area when we talk about the western interior forest. 141 million acres is a large area, but less than half of those acres is commercial timber, and then it's only about 6% of the timber that we use in this country comes from this area. It's mostly lumber, then also plywood. Plywood is when you take, you basically, you don't quite pulp the wood like we do to make paper and all that, but basically you take the wood for plywood and chipboard. You basically take the wood and you cut it into, you basically chip it up into little pieces, and then you glue all those pieces together and form kind of these sheets of wood. talked about the mountain pine beetle problems with the fire suppression and fuel buildup issues. And then these areas are extremely popular for recreation. They're popular in terms of rangeland management as well, because you get a lot of grassland and woodland, savanna, and shrubland areas bumping up to these areas. And then water issues with these areas, because water is always a limiting factor in the West because there's just not a lot of it available. But that is also how our national forest and national park kind of came to be, is the idea that we wanted to protect our water. This area does feature a few national parks. I've worked at a couple of them. This area has Yellowstone National Park. One that I've worked at is Grand Teton National Park, which actually connects to the southern part of Yellowstone National Park. And then also Rocky Mountain National Park is another place that I've worked at.